Okay, so this video is going to be kind of dry just because I didn't take a whole lot of footage of us actually pulling the motor out of the Tahoe and putting it in the 68. And the footage that I did have, all but one of them became a corrupted file for whatever reason. So I'm just going to kind of try and talk through a lot of the stuff that we had to deal with. Okay, so the good news about swapping one of these 5.7s into a C-10 that already had a V8 is the motor mounts already match up. The 68 originally had a 307 V8, and I believe it still has the original motor mounts in it. Even right now, they're still just hooked up to the Vortec. But if they're not the same mounts, just because I don't know all of the history of it, those mounts at the very least are the same mounts for the 74-ish 350 that was in the truck whenever my dad had it. So the truck has had 3 motors in it. It's had a 307, a 70-something 350, and now it has the Vortec in it right now. And there were no frame modifications in putting any of those motors in there. The blocks for all 350s up until the LS motors, which are just a completely different animal, all those blocks are the same. You can look on the 5.7 Vortec and see on the front passenger side, it still has in the casting where you can see where a mechanical fuel pump would go, but there's just no hole there. So the systems are pretty much exactly the same. Hi, Callie. What are you doing? The systems are pretty much, or the blocks are pretty much the same. It's just minor changes here and there, but it makes for a pretty easy swap. The problem is going to come in whenever you're swapping the transmission, but I'll get to that in a second. So the building I'm in right now was made specifically for this project. This is a building that mostly my dad made. I helped here and there whenever I could, but I was working full-time whenever this was being constructed. And you notice there's a chain hoist here, and this is just a Chinese-made 3-ton chain hoist. I went with 3-ton just because I didn't, it made me just sleep a little better at night knowing that it was rated for easily 4 times what I was ever going to use it for. And the roof is actually designed to support any load that we would lift from this. All the joists, I believe those are 2x10s. Hi, Scooby. And then there's a beam up in the loft that runs across 6 of them, so it spreads the load across 6 joists, which makes it really strong. Whenever we pulled out that motor, the building didn't creak or move at all. It was, all the math was done right and done good. So, gotta have something to pull the motor out. And probably the biggest pain with this swap was having to deal with getting the transmission out of the Tahoe. And all of the 40-plus year mechanics on all these forums that show up whenever you start searching crap like this, basically from what I read, all said that it is just absolutely impossible. You can't take it out take out the transmission without disconnecting the transfer case first, because this Tahoe was a 4-wheel drive. And so what I did is I set the Tahoe up on jack stands as best I could, or at least the front of it. I undid the crossmember for the transmission, moved it as far back as I could, and then Nathan and I, hi Scooby. What are you doing? Then Nathan and I kind of half pulled out the motor using the chain hoist to support it, and you want to be sure there's a kind of an attachment hook up by the power steering pump, but you want to make sure you have the back of the motor supported with your lift somehow, because or else the motor will just tip back like that, as we found out when we started lifting it. So you want to make sure the back of the motor is secure. And so you pull the motor forward a little bit after you undo all the lines and all the 3 torque converter bolts, all that crap. Pull the drive shaft out. and then that'll allow you to kind of wiggle the transmission out of there, and you can get the transmission out. And then what we had to do with the transmission is, once we split the transfer case from it, sent it over to one of my dad's friends, and he had to change the output shaft so that it could have a two-wheel drive tail shaft on it, because this is a two-wheel drive pickup. And I think that cost us about 60 bucks. He did it more of as a favor, and you know, I appreciate him doing that. So that's pretty much all that went into the transmission, getting it out of the Tahoe. So getting the motor out of the Tahoe, that's not that big of a deal. The only thing I can stress is take photos of all your connections, and you know, don't just take a photo of the connector. Take a photo, you know, fairly wide photo of where you can see where that connector's at and what the colored wires are, hopefully. Label everything. Label everything. Hey, get out of that. What's the matter with you? For instance, instead of Nathan and I trying to figure out who had labeled what, I just took the first letter of my name, he took the first letter of his name, and we just started labeling. Like I did T1 through T10, and he did N1 through N8 or something like that. And that was the system we did, and that worked decent. But the probably the best way to do it is if you actually videoed where it was, so you can say, hey, this wire runs down to the front headlights or something, and video the connection and video everything. That's honestly what I would recommend. But we were going to try and use the wiring harness, and my dad worked hard trying to, you know, make that wiring harness in that Tahoe work, but it was just so complicated to the point that it needed so much work to make that work. And I asked the auto tech guy at my specialty school, and he said he personally would never touch one of those wiring harnesses unless he had to, because they are just stupid complicated. I mean, the fuel pump relay runs down to the transmission, so because somehow, based on what gear the transmission is, the computer then changes the rate the fuel pump's running, and part of the starter relay runs into the roof of the car, and just all kinds of stuff like that don't make sense. So we ended up just biting the bullet and buying the wiring harness for it. And they are friggin' expensive, but we shouldn't have any problems with it. That's the goal, is to not have to have any problems with it. Yes, you probably could cut down your own, although I was told it would take a professional at least 100 hours to cut down one of those wiring harnesses and make it work. 100 hours. And if you're not a professional, then you run the risk of, you know, screwing up the PCM when you hook the battery up to it and try and start it, or you just run into the risk of having problems later down the road. So we just decided, my dad and I, that we were just going to get a wiring harness for it, just to save a lot of heartache. And the last hurdle you're going to have to overcome is if your C-10, and this one is a 68 again, and it had a 3 on the tree. And what's different about the 3 on a tree is that manual transmission has the trans mount up closer to the engine instead of far back like an automatic. And so what problem that creates is the bell housing for the 4L60E will not fit between the floor of the cab and that cross member. So what you're going to have to do, and really this is the only feasible way I found to cut this out, is you're going to just have to cut the rivets for the cross member. And so here's the cross member right here. And how this sat in the truck is it sat like this, and these two pieces right here went between the frame rail, this one and this one, upper frame rail, lower frame rail. And so how I cut this out without lifting the cab or doing anything crazy, ground off that, and the bottom ones on the frame, those were easy to grind off. This one was pretty easy to grind off. This one was the problem. Because it's so far up against the cab, I couldn't get a grinder in there, so I had to use a Sawzall with a metal cutting blade to cut that one and that one right there. And once you cut these out, and I used just a tire iron and a sledgehammer to beat them out, this pretty much, you hit it a couple times with a fairly sizable hammer and it just falls out, and then that's out of your way. So that's how I took care of that. So that pretty much covers the motor and the transmission. The motor is pretty much a direct fit in there. Transmission, we had to also buy a trans mount for it. and I can't remember the website that it came from off the top of my head, but it was a direct fit and made for putting a 4L60E in one of these 67 to 72 C-10s. And so far it's worked out pretty good. I mean, I'm pleased with the quality of it. So that pretty much covers putting the drivetrain in there. The radiator, which is sitting back over there from the Tahoe, I was hoping of using that pickup because, I mean, that radiator is perfectly fine and it's a pretty big radiator. But the two radiators are considerably different sizes. So then, thought, well, maybe we'll just use the original radiator. But that has to be the thinnest radiator I have ever seen in my life. Not to say it wouldn't work by any means, but it is... It's just, I don't know. I just didn't want to have any problems with cooling, so that's why I went to LMC and I just bought a radiator for it since it wasn't too expensive as far as a full metal radiator is concerned. So really the motor is pretty much the only thing from a Tahoe that'll fit in there without any modifications. The transmission takes modification, the master cylinder takes modification. Had to buy a radiator, there was no way around, well, couldn't use the radiator from the Tahoe, there was no way around that. The wiring is a bit of a disaster, although it would be nice to have used it. We're still going to use the PCM though. Trying to look around here and see, oh, the oil cooler. So, this truck, I don't know what it originally came with, but at some point my dad had put headers on it from a 80-something C-10. So the truck had headers on it, and the 9957 Vortec has a kind of right angle oil filter adapter to it with an oil cooler, and that happens to run directly into the header. So we had to do away with that, and I don't know if, I'm not sure what we're going to do with that at the moment right now. I have it set up where I could just put the big standard truck filter on there instead of the small one that adapter takes, or I may go ahead and just find a vertical oil cooler adapter and put that on there, but that's kind of up in the wind right now. But so I had to change that, so it has headers from an 80-something C-10, I believe. Pretty much other than that, I mean, it's not a real complicated swap as far as getting there. Whenever you get into the electronics, that's whenever it starts getting a little complicated. So here's the 350 I was talking about that came out of that truck. And right down there where the fuel pump goes, that was the slot I was talking about that you can still see on the Vortec. There's just not a hole there, but it still has some of the casting there. So you may be asking yourself, well, why aren't you using this motor since it clearly has high compression pistons in it and is about halfway through a rebuild? Well, the problem with this motor is a number of things. One, really my dad's biggest concern with it is that he didn't think it would be able to run on pump gas. It'd be running too high of compression. And so then the other problem is that, I don't know, he just absolutely hates carburetors because that's what he had to grow up with. And then once the Tahoe got wrecked, we had a 40,000 mile engine and a rebuilt transmission that were essentially going to go to the scrapyard if they didn't go in something. So that's kind of why we decided to set this motor to the side, probably put it in something someday, and that's why we decided to go with the Vortec and the 4L60E as opposed to this 350 and this completely untested 3-speed automatic. So again, I apologize that I didn't better document all of this, all these events that happened. It just kind of wasn't on my priority list at the time. I'm going to try to do better on documenting further progress on the 68. But pretty much all that I mentioned here isn't, was pretty easy to deal with in the grand scheme of things. Maybe the wiring harness wasn't easy on the wallet, but hopefully it should work out a lot better than trying to cut down the original wiring harness. So that pretty much covers everything that I can think of right now that we've had to do to it whenever we first started. So hope you enjoyed the video. and hope you have a lot of success with your project.